as when my brother fell. He's referring to like when one of his close friends passes away from the AIDS virus, and he deals with this obviously a lot in the community, and he like I've like what I analyze it to be is that when his brother like when his like friend dies, he takes the burden with him, the responsibility of living only. Oh, another thing that I also forgot to mention is Essex Hemphill also was also diagnosed with AIDS. So I like to me like this poem like is like when he sees a friend of him dying, when he sees another brother falling, he must pick up where they left off and continue in their stead as someone who also has AIDS. He obviously does see like the future, it does seem bleak, but he must again continue on and express his like the weapons that he picks up is his voice and his word is what I'm really trying to get at. Like the weapons that he picks up are in actuality like his word and his speech is what makes him to be powerful. And one thing that interested me was a needle and thread were not among his things I found, because a needle and thread, this saying is also talked again in Tomb of Sorrow, which he does bring up again. So he brings it up in a different manner, which I will talk about when I get to that poem. Um, a needle and thread, usually, obviously, a needle and thread is to create something, and when when he said a needle and thread is not what I found, it's like that's the end. That's the end of that person's journey, and that he will no his journey will no longer be written or be created or be sewn. It is what I really thought of that stanza of the poem. Another thing that I also want to mention is that the weapons could also be symbolized as that person's strength, that person's courage and tenacity, and it could be mobilized into Essex Hemphill's own as he faces the same trials and tribulations that his brothers before him face. So also moving on to the occupied territories poem, something that a little background behind this, because there's one line that I want to focus on specifically. Um, when he says, "You are not to touch other flesh." Oh my god. You have to touch other flesh without a police permit. You have no privacy. The state wants you to seize your bed and sleep with you. The state wants to control your sexuality, your birth rate, your passion. The message is clear. Your penis, your vagina, your testicles, your womb, your anus, your orgasm. These belong to the state. You are not to touch yourself to be familiar with ecstasy. The erogenous zones are not demilitarized. So when I read this, I had to do a little background information on the time period of when this was written, and it was written during Ronald Reagan's administration. And Ronald Reagan's administration towards the AIDS crisis, the way they dealt with it, to put it simply, they didn't really deal with it at all, and they thought of it as a joke. And what they did, they sort of outcasted the LGBTQ community and continued to put this stigma that AIDS was a gay plague and that the only people that could get it were LGBTQ members. And the Ronald Reagan administration did absolutely nothing to destigmatize this, and they did absolutely nothing to fund for aid towards the AIDS crisis, towards the AIDS and HIV crisis, and they didn't really do much of anything, and they just let the death toll continue to rise. So when Essex Hemphill was talking about how the state wants to seize your bed and sleep with you, to me, what this really meant was that the state doesn't allow LGBT community members to be free to have sex for who they please, and the state by letting people ostracize them and to think that, oh, the AIDS HIV virus is the gay plague. By doing that, automatically they're oppressing the gay. They're automatically they're oppressing the gay community, and they're oppressing the LGBTQ community, and and he goes and he even states the state wants to control your sexuality, your birth rate by the Ronald Reagan administration not doing anything for the AIDS HIV crisis. They were really making it um so they're really making it, I would say, like obviously worse, especially worse for the LGBTQ community because they were the victims that were that were being attacked not only for the AIDS HIV crisis, but now they're being ostracized by other people, and now people are being misinformed about who can get it, how it can be um, transmitted, and yeah, so what I that's really what I thought about the occupied territories, the that the LGBTQ community in this time felt so ostracized and so controlled, like so ostracized because the state wasn't doing anything, and because of this they felt controlled that they couldn't do what they wanted because people were immediately scared or immediately didn't want to or just assume that they already had the virus, um, and to go to the so to skip to the Tomb of Sorrow, which is one of the most important poems in Essex Hemphill's book ceremonies. The Tomb of Sorrows, it's split into obviously a few parts, so I'm going to go by each part. Um, yes, I'm gonna go by each part. So the first part to me, another thing that people should know about the background about Essex Hemphill is that he was born in Washington D.C., raised in Washington D.C., and people should know the background behind Washington D.C. and the spot Washington D.C. It's obviously a very political place, a very political era, especially during this time. I mean, it's during every time, but especially during this time. Um, and part one really battles with how he says gunshots ring above our heads as we sit beneath your favorite tree in this park called Meriden Hill, called Alcom X, that you call the Tomb of Sorrow. So what I analyze this to be is that in Washington D.C., especially like downtown Washington D.C., there are spots that gun violence, and gang violence is really prevalent. So, in the first part, Essex Hemphill seems to be talking about how him, a black queer man, is living and living and trying to be loved while also being in this midst of gun violence and gang violence during this, and especially during Washington D.C. in the downtown area in the 1990s. Moving on to part two, one theme that I want to bring up was theology, and the reason I want to bring up theology is because Essex Hemphill talks about when I die, honey child, my angels will be tall black drag queens. So I feel like here he's rewriting what theology is so known to be as, which is usually white, like what is planted in our heads that white theology, it's supposed to be like a white man God, but what Essex Hemphill seems to be doing here is rewriting everything of what theology seems to be, and I, sorry, and he says black drag queens, I will eat their stockings as they fling them to the blue shadows of dawn. So here I feel like he's challenging the norm. He's definitely challenging the norm of what people think theology is, and he definitely dethrones the normative of the white God the Father, and he places here the idea of black queer theology, and how when he goes to heaven he will be addressed by black drag queens, and he will see the sequins, and I will suck their purple lips to anoint my mouth, and he will be greeted with a kiss. And another thing that I want to add in part two, he also says, my witnesses will have, on page 81, my witnesses will have to answer the go-go music. And if you're looking back in history of go-go music actually was actually, it was more practiced by the black community, and it was founded in Washington D.C. within the black community. So go-go music, not only was it utilized by the black community, but it was utilized by the black queer community as well. So, and for this to be played at his funeral, it shows a tone of how, like, in it shows basically a tone how he wants his funeral to be not remembered as sad, and to be to have the aspect of being black and being loud and being queer, because that's just like because that's also the messages that go-go music actually portrayed, especially during this time. And another thing that I also found interesting was that as I looked up go-go music, the police and politicians in Washington D.C. actually characterized go-go music as disreputable and sound of the city's poor. And in Washington D.C., the city's poor was mostly socially, economically, it was mostly made up of black and brown people. So it also shows like the view that the Washington D.C. Police and politicians had on black communities, and especially that of black queer communities, since go-go music was mostly practiced within black queer circles. Um, and one last thing, 13 minutes. One last thing that I also like to add is the very end on page 90 of Tomb of Sorrow. He says, I rummaged through ancestral memories in search of the original tribes that fathered us. I want to remember the exact practices of civility we agreed upon. I want us to remember the nobility of decency. So this stanza goes back to it really goes back to his, like he says, his ancestral roots, and it goes back to his ancestral roots in Africa, and how in all the way back in Africa there was no supreme person on top. There was nothing to discriminate anybody, and there was no like idea of white supremacy. And here he's saying that he wants us to remember the nobility of decency, which means he wants us to go back to a time where people coexisted, and how especially and our ancestors, like in Africa, coexisted, and they lived in a time where they respected each other and lived in a civil time. So I found that part really interesting, how he says, I want us to remember that, how he wants the audience to remember that 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 the African black community is not an idea, is not something that should be oppressed, and that we should and that it was always something to be respected and revered for, like back in our ancestors. That is basically all. I'm running out of time. It's 15 minutes at this point. That's basically what I want to say about presentation about this poem, and I will leave everybody off with one question, which is Essex Hemphill. He brings up the theme of a needle and thread. He brings up in the first poem, and he also brings up in Tomb of Sorrow in part 4, where he says, oh, it's in part 5, where he says, where's my needle, fetch my thread, I'm going to sew a prince to my bed. And here it seems that just it seems that he's, well, in my interpretation, it's that when he's bringing up his needle and his thread, he's sewing another part of his life, or he's creating another part of his life that he wants to happen, like a dream of some sort. So my question to you is, what is your interpretation of my needle, of the terms needle and thread that he brings up in ceremonies? That is my presentation. I'm so sorry it's so long.